Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, is public sentiment turning against Trump's authoritarianism from Puzzle-Headed Bid 1579, and that was a self-post that they made, and they said, I honestly can't tell, and obviously there was billion pills and opinion pieces all saying that he either has the lowest approval rating of all time, or that he's surging in popularity. What do you think? And my thoughts on that are, I think outside of a few fringe Redditors, I think most people, are kind of used to Trump at this point. He's been in the headlines for pretty much every day of the past decade. So, I think people have mostly just grown accustomed to his authoritarianism, if anything. Same with pretty much, he's pretty much just any other politician at this point, despite Reddit acting like he's the worst thing ever. So, I would say that people really aren't turning against it. People are just really, most people are really just, I think a lot of people are where they were at this point last year. If you loved Trump back then, you probably still love him today. If you hated Trump back then, you probably still hate him today. If you were ambivalent on him back then, you probably still are ambivalent on him today. I think most people probably don't change their opinions too much on the man. Haven't changed since probably since the January 6th at the latest, I would say. He's not really a guy you change opinions on too much. Most people who have hated him have always hated him since day one. Most people who've loved him since day one. Most people who are ambivalent on him have been ambivalent on him since day one. So that's my thoughts on that. And yeah, next we have, let's move all the red districts and counties in the Pacific Rim states into Idaho from BrilliantMaps.com, posted by Spare Simeon. And they said, this doesn't require federal approval. There's no law against state swapping districts. I recall reading that West Virginia had volunteered to take red counties from the Atlantic states. Imagine upstate New York becoming part of West Virginia. And yeah, personally, I think that's a good idea. I think if counties or areas don't feel welcome in the state they're in, they should be more than welcome to secede and join another state that more suits their values. With that being said, I would argue that the libertarian position is to support secession down to the individual level. So, ultimately, if you don't like where your county is seceding into, I think you should be free to secede from your county. Maybe just have your own house be your administrative unit, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Libertarians are for freedom of association, so that does mean secession down to the individual level. And yeah, that's my thoughts there. Associate with whoever you want to. You shouldn't be forced to associate with anyone who you don't feel like associating with. And yeah, that's my thoughts there. Then we have a fork in the road. Where do we go from here? And that's from Quick Expert, host from Quick Expert 9. That's crossover from the Libertarian Party USA subreddit. And they said, it's no secret that this movement in the Libertarian Party has lost its way. This post essay will probably ruffle some feathers on here, but its purpose is to spark dialogue and address the not so subtle elephant in the room. The movement is shrinking. LP membership is on the decline. Coffers are empty, and the reputation of the LP and libertarianism is in the garbage. I think it is important to diagnose the cause of this decline and assess where our path forward should be moving forward. There are two events in our past I've blamed for its outcome. You might be surprised in how far back these events are, but I believe the cause and effect are not always evident for a long time. Frank Meyer's 1950s fusionism, which was an unholy combination between libertarianism and conservatism, and Murray Rothbard's open courting of the disaffected and often racist paleo-conservatives in the 1970s when the Republican Party went neoliberal. The company shifted the paradigm of both big and small L libertarianism. Prior to these events, libertarianism was exclusively a leftist ideology, committing to a social liberalism, and the right and left variants of the movement described positions on economic policy, not social policy. Instead, right and left libertarianism in the U.S. came to define social policy, with economic policy being dictated by the Austrian school exclusively. This is a pretty good clip from Noam Chomsky on this phenomenon, and why U.S. libertarians end up not being very libertarian at all. And then they have a lot more paragraphs of that, pretty much. And yeah, personally, a lot of people say libertarianism is a left versus right thing. I would argue that the lens in which libertarianism should be looked at is not left versus right. It should be individual versus collective. Libertarianism is an individual thing, not a collective thing, and that's why I think people get caught up on the left-right stuff. Libertarian is right wing. Libertarian is left wing. They get lost in the forest. And yeah, we should. I think left right is a very rudimentary way of looking at politics. You should at the very least look at it more like a political compass. Like you got the authoritarian left and authoritarian right, and the libertarian left and libertarian right. And yeah, personally, I would argue, I would even argue to disregard left and right as labels as a whole. What should matter is individual versus collective. That's what the labels that matter should be, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump's trade will art bill posted by Proton13, and that's a cross post from the Clever Comeback subreddit, and that's a tweet from the Gray Man. The Trump administration is expected to begin paying $14.5 billion to farmers by the end of August to make up for income lost in the trade war, and then Rick Wilson replied, "Behold, socialism." And I would agree with that. Trump is a Democrat from 2009, despite people saying he's the conservative vanguard. I personally I think MAGA socialism / MAGA communism is kind of a thing with him. His economics are rather progressive, even and rather Bernie-like, if I do say so myself. Even though Reddit would never admit that, because Reddit says Bernie good, Orange Man bad. But I do think Trump, that they always say, oh, he's just your typical conservative politician. Well, no, I think a lot of his rhetoric does lean progressive economically. He always wants to say, throw money at the people who vote for me, and a lot of people who voted for him are poor rural whites. So I do think that's something that's to take into account. And yeah, so just because the Trump Reddit would say Trump isn't a socialist, that doesn't mean he isn't a socialist. I would argue that pretty much every president in the past 100 years has been some form of socialist, even if they call themselves conservative. Because conservatism has shown, if there's one thing that it's shown, it's that conservatism conserves absolutely nothing, and increasingly it just becomes being a progressive from 10 or so years ago. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Noam says conditions could back suspension of habeas corpus from thehill.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan, and that's a cross post from the law subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't think habeas corpus has any chance of being suspended. I think that's just kind of Reddit circle jerking, that they might say, oh, we might suspend habeas corpus, but I think that's just gusto. I don't think it has any chance of actually happening. And even if it does happen, habeas corpus is just some terms they use to justify that their actions. The state can already do whatever it wants to you, even if habeas corpus is in effect. The state can essentially kidnap you, and you might have no recourse since they have the monopoly on legal force. And sadly, that's how the world works sometimes. Those who have the monopoly on legal use of force can pretty much justify whatever they want to, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Then we have Trump writes Congress out of the Constitution and Congress says fine, from NewRepublic.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan, and that's a cross post from the law subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think that's just this is just some more fear mongering from the New Republic. Reddit's pretty much all just orange man bad fear mongering at this point. And I personally think Congress has been declining in influence since Woodrow Wilson took office. Woodrow Wilson takes office and pretty much centralizes power in the presidency and takes a lot of power away from Congress. But Reddit only seems to care when Donald Trump to centralize his power in the presidency and takes power away from Congress, even though that's been the norm for most of the past century at this point. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Supreme Court rules for woman whose son was killed by police, from news.bloomberglaw.com, posted by Doctor Who 07. And yeah, I don't really care for the police. Hopefully, let's see, it's small one. Let's see what they said. Small one here. It says, whoever an officer acted reasonably using force, the court must consider all the relevant circumstances, including facts and evidence leading up to a climactic moment, Justice Elena Kagan wrote in the court's opinion. And Scholars is the only stance of his acceptable just to say you feared for your safety in the moment. I'd like to see more, but the fact is, there's a big enough one for now. And I would agree with that. Ultimately, the state won't hold the cops accountable. The courts always won't usually hold the cops accountable, since the court and the cops are both run by the state, and the state doesn't like to hold itself accountable a lot of the time. And yeah, it does seem like they're trying to hold him accountable this time. But I won't hold my breath. The state is always going to be against the individual, no matter how much progress it seems is being made. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have family claims woman declared brain dead, but pregnancy continues due to state law. From 11alive.com, posted by Dr. 07. And yeah, personally, I don't think I think if she wanted to get an abortion, she should get an abortion. But if she's brain dead, I guess she couldn't really make a choice of whether to get an abortion or not. So if they want to err on that or of caution side of caution, that's fine. But just because that's a hard one because if you're brain dead, you can't really decide anything. So. I personally think if she's brain dead, just let her have the baby. I guess maybe she should have had something written down prior to being brain dead or about whether to abort the baby or not. But ultimately, people will justify what they justify, especially in regards to abortion. So if they want to have her deliver the baby, even if she's brain dead, that's what they'll justify, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have massive cost of Trump's birthday military parade revealed. Never let maggots and then never let maggots get responsibility from the Libis.com by CH Warlocks. And yeah, that just goes to show you how people a lot of Republicans say they're fiscally responsible, but those that spend money like the Democrats will, they might not have as high taxes, but they'll still they might say, oh, we'll have tax cuts, but they'll still spend like there's no tomorrow and still push us into a deficit. Even if they do cut taxes, you can't just cut taxes, you also have to cut spending. And Republicans, they'll just spend like there's no tomorrow. They're pretty much Democrats in that regard. That's why they're pretty much a uniparty. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.